This is Kudo speaking, President of Genron NPO. It's time to begin the Tokyo Conference 2021 Day 2. I would like to thank all the panelists for taking part in this discussion and also all the viewers who are joining us from the live stream. Thank you very much for that. So we discussed whether Asia's peace can be protected through Indo-Pacific strategy. After the pandemic is over, what kind of difficulties are there for the global economy and democracies? How can we restore democracy and a liberal order, as well as the multilateralism? 10 think tanks who are the members of the Tokyo Conference, as well as the relevant 6 guests, discussed these matters. Following yesterday's discussion, we are going to be discussing how to restore the liberal economic order and democracy and international cooperation. Under this overall theme, we will have the discussions today. Now we'd like to begin the keynote lecture part of today's meeting. We have 4 political leaders who are the representatives of the world. First, I would like to invite Mr. Kevin Rudd, former Prime Minister of Australia, and the President and CEO of Asia Society. Mr. Rudd has given his insights in terms of the conflict between the US and China in many occasions. Mr. Rudd, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me clearly? Good. It is good to be with you at this conference. The subject that you have proposed is an important one, which is the restoration of the liberal international rules-based order. Let me make some opening remarks about what the liberal international rules-based order has meant in the past before I go to the challenges for the future and what we can do about it. The first thing to say about the liberal international order is that it is ultimately anchored in the reality of American global and regional power. America, as we know, emerged as the victor state after the Second World War. And it was anchored in American power that decisions were taken both at the San Francisco Conference and earlier at the Bretton Woods Conference to begin to build the institutions of what we would later call the liberal international order or the liberal international rules-based order. What its meaning was, of course, it meant an order based on open economies, open societies, as well as a system in which states in their international behavior was anchored to the greatest extent possible in the principles of agreed international legal norms. Open societies, open economies, also open political systems as well, and an international legal system which ultimately framed the rules of international conduct. That, of course, brings me to the second pillar of the liberal international order, and that is the contemporary robustness or lack thereof of the institutions of the order. When we look at those critical institutions, they are made up of the United Nations, in particular, the UN Security Council. They are made up of institutions like the International Monetary Fund. They are made up of institutions like the World Trade Organization. And they are made up also in terms of global human rights governance through institutions like the Human Rights Council in Geneva. And so the relevant question is, how robust are those institutions today in upholding, developing further, and critically enforcing international legal norms? As I said, these are the 2 pillars upon which the liberal international order has been constructed. The reality of American geostrategic power and geoeconomic power, and then secondly, the institutions which the Americans, together with others, voluntarily constructed in the decades following the Second World War. And we are left today with the question about how well functioning those institutions are. Let us come to the present then. What challenges does the international liberal order face? Well, I think we face 2 sets of intersecting problems which proceed from the earlier analysis. One is that American global power and global leadership has been deeply and negatively affected by the experience of the Trump administration. In part, that is because the United States, under the Trump presidency, decided to attack the credibility of the institutions of global governance. You saw extraordinary decisions by the Trump administration, for example, to refuse to engage in the reforms necessary of the World Trade Organization by appointing new members of the appellate body of the World Trade Organization, thereby rendering it effectively ineffective. On top of that, you had the Trump administration pursue active protectionist policies itself, or policies which we would call mercantilist. And as a result, American actions on trade alone began to roll back the consensus which had previously been constructed around free trade, and on top of that, about the institution responsible for governing free trade, namely the WTO. It didn't stop, however, with the WTO. I mentioned before global human rights governance. The decision by, again, the Trump administration to withdraw from the Human Rights Council in Geneva was a most foolish initiative. By depleting the HRC of one of the strong and continuing voices of liberal democracy in the West was a self-defeating move. And thirdly, of course, the Trump administration completed its demolition job of the liberal international order by withdrawing from the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC. Those, of course, represented one set of challenges which we now face. The second, of course, is that as the United States had withdrawn, China, which represents a different worldview to the liberal international order, has sought to occupy the vacuum left by our American friends. Increasingly, we see Chinese activism in each of these institutions. And as a consequence, through China's foreign policy and economic footprint around the world, leveraging its political support in active support of Chinese candidatures for leading international institutions as well. So as America has withdrawn during the Trump years, China has in fact arrived and become much more prevalent. And the third factor which has been unfolding is this, is that the relativities between geostrategic and geoeconomic power between the United States and other states, including China, has narrowed considerably since the outcome of the Second World War in the late 1940s. Now we look at the possibility of China becoming the world's largest economy by the end of the 2020s, the possibility, not the inevitability. We look at also the closing military gap between China and the United States in East Asia, to the point where Chinese military leaders at the recent National People's Congress in Beijing stated that a degree of regional parity had been achieved between China and the United States within East Asia and the West Pacific. So therefore, these factors have come together. American withdrawal under Trump, China becoming more active in institutions of global governance and representing a different worldview, and a narrowing in the, let's call it, underpinning balance of power, which is that balance of power which constructed the order in the first place. To conclude my remarks, let me say this. What then shall be done? What can be done for those of us who wish to see the continuation and the strengthening of the liberal international rules-based order into the future? Two things, I think, stand out. Number one, it is a welcome development that the Biden administration is back, and that America is therefore back and believing not just in its bilateral alliances around the world, but also believing and committed to the fabric of multilateral governance around the world as well, which forms the architecture of the liberal international rules-based system. America is back in the climate conference, America is back in the WTO, America will be back in the HRC, and America is back in terms of its traditional roles in funding through institutions like USAID as well. So that is good. But the question mark in people's mind is, what will happen in 2024, and will America revert to a new form of Trumpianism in the future? And that's something none of us can answer. Therefore, that brings me to my second recommendation for the future, something which I've written about in The Economist and elsewhere in the last 12 months. If the great powers are going to be divided on the future of the liberal international rules-based order, and if America's future will be determined in part by the future of its own domestic political processes, then the rest of us, which are liberal democracies, countries like Japan, countries like the Republic of Korea, countries like Canada, countries like Australia, countries like Indonesia, countries like India, countries like France, Germany, Britain, the European Union, and the other Europeans, need to form a core group, which I've in the past called the Democratic 10, with one single objective, which is to continue to drive consensus around the funding and fulfillment of the mandate of these critical institutions of global governance. Unless we do that as a core group of states, and frankly, the tendency of the institutions of the liberal international order will always be in the direction of inertia. And in the absence of American leadership, further inertia. If America remains partners with us in this leadership project, then in fact, the liberal international order has a strong future. But if America falters in the future through further twists and turns in its domestic politics, it will be left to another group, what I call the Democratic 10, middle powers across the world to pool their resources to underpin the future of international law and the institutions and arrangements of open societies, open economies, and ultimately of open politics as well. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank
you so much, Mr. Brad. You have mentioned D10, which is 10 democracies. They have to be the protector of multilateralism and also liberal order in the world. Thank you very much. Now I'd like to invite the next speaker. In 2019, he came to Japan in the democracy meeting of the Genron NPO. He is the 12th Secretary General of NATO and former Prime Minister of Denmark, Mr. Anders Fogh Rasmussen. Together with Mr. Biden and Mr. Blair, he launched the Copenhagen Democracy Summit back in 2018. And since then, he has been a very vocal proponent of global democracy. Mr. Rasmussen, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to join you at the General NPO, and thanks to Mr. Kudo for inviting me. I wish to pay tribute to your former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. I worked with him to develop Europe and NATO's ties with Japan, including signing a partnership with NATO. Japan is stronger and the world freer thanks to his work. And we look forward to working with Prime Minister Suga to build on that legacy. Ladies and gentlemen, as Mr. Kudo mentioned, only 16 months ago, I had the pleasure of being with you in Tokyo. The world has changed a lot. Throughout the pandemic, we saw unprecedented peacetime limits placed on freedom. Now we must build back better, with more freedom, more fairness, and more democracy for all. In this respect, I'm actually more optimistic today than when I addressed you in 2019. America is back in its global leadership role, as Kevin Roth mentioned. Europe is becoming less naive about its vulnerabilities. Now we can focus on repairing our alliances and rebuild multilateralism to serve the rules-based international order. Today, I have 3 suggestions for how we can start a fight back for freedom. First, we should cement a democratic alliance to retune multilateralism. Secondly, we need to make technology work for democracy. And thirdly, the free world needs a new, united and democratic approach to the Indo-Pacific. First, we need to build new forms of alliances, ones built on common values. But given the tools and teeth needed to defend those values, we need an alliance of democracies. I founded the Alliance of Democracies Foundation in 2017 to make this argument. President Biden was an early supporter of our initiative. He opened our first annual summit, the Copenhagen Democracy Summit, in 2018 and co-founded our Transatlantic Commission on Election Integrity. As president, he has pledged to hold a similar gathering under his own patronage later this year. A global summit that his platform says will renew the spirit and shared purpose of nations of the free world. In the coming months, we will hear more from the White House on how his Global Democracy Summit will work and who will be invited. At the Alliance of Democracies Foundation, we have been developing ideas. One such idea is an economic Article 5 among democracies, a principle to counter economic coercion by authoritarian powers. This would mirror NATO's Article 5, which says an attack on one is an attack on all. But it should apply to the economic field, because in 2021, attacks no longer come solely down the barrel of the gun. The world's democracies should agree that a state coming under economic attack due to its democratic or human rights stance could ask for unified support. Recently, Australia has seen how China uses economic power to bully. Its wine producers have felt the full force of Chinese protectionism simply because Canberra has criticized Beijing's human rights record. It seems that the same tactic is at play with China's sudden ban of Taiwanese products. I'm heartened that many Japanese buyers have come to the rescue. And this brings me to my second point, making technology work for democracy. The fact that I'm able to be with you today shows the positive power of technology. But technology also damages our freedoms. The alternative, digital authoritarianism, is on the rise. And in that context, the free world's disunity over emerging technology represents an existential threat to freedom. Especially across the Atlantic, this widening gap has given succor to China and other autocratic regimes as they forge ahead in two senses. First, in developing new technology, and second, in establishing the rules and norms of emerging tech. These rules and norms will guide every aspect of our lives, economies, and security for generations. This is why we need to build a technological alliance of democracies. President Biden now has the makings of a blueprint for how to develop this. The US National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence recently published its final report. It proposes the United States build an emerging technology coalition to establish democratic norms and values. Such a coalition represents a good start. It will only be successful if we align Atlantic and Pacific partners on emerging technology. Japan has led the way in the discussion on data. Prime Minister Abe's proposal for a global data flows with trust agreement was visionary. Chinese authoritarianism can suck in data with no regard for privacy. So, the free world needs to share our metadata within a strong framework of protection. This would enable us to both win the race and set the norms and standards for emerging tech. Ultimately, when it comes to tech, the free world needs a simple approach. United, we win. Divided, we fail. This brings me to my third and final point. Europe needs a robust strategy for the Indo-Pacific. To me, one thing is clear. From the South China Sea to the Taiwan Strait, from the streets of Hong Kong to the wineries of Australia, and the democracy defenders from Myanmar to Thailand. The front line between the free world and the autocratic world is being drawn in the Indo-Pacific. And Europe lacks a game plan. Here again, we should look to Japan for inspiration on its approach of a free and open Indo-Pacific. For Europe, we continue to be torn between commercial interests on one hand and our values on the other. But if we continue to put our interests before our values, we will eventually see both our interests and our values decline. This is why the EU's forthcoming Indo-Pacific strategy needs teeth rather than empty words. A strategy that sets out how we will continue to integrate our economic and political efforts with democracies like Japan and allies in the region such as the Indo-Pacific Quad. A strategy that has a strong military component, showing we're willing to back up our statements, especially on freedom of navigation and defense of democracy in the region. To me, this strategy is a litmus test for whether the EU is serious about protecting democracy around the world. Ladies and gentlemen, as we build back from COVID, we have an opportunity for change. we can put democracy back in the ascendancy around the world. It is a cause for which millions of freedom fighters have dedicated their lives and for which many have paid the ultimate price. And it is a cause worth fighting for, because there is no greater force on this planet than the desire for human freedom. So let's go to work in building an alliance of democracies that will deliver freedom, democracy, and peace for generations to come. And you can join me at our upcoming Copenhagen Democracy Summit on the 10th and 11th of May for that effort. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rasmussen. Protecting freedom and democracy's alliance is required to protect the freedom, and then multilateralism and technologies are part of the foundation of that. And also you discussed the issue of South East Asia and Indo-Pacific. So, and you said that this is the test bed of the democracy and how we can protect it, and the democracies, democratic nations, how the meaning of mutual cooperation amongst the democratic nations has been emphasized by your strong message. Thank you very much. Next, and I would like to ask, I would like to introduce the next speaker, who is Mr. Christian Wulff, former president of Germany. In 2010, he became the youngest president of Germany, and he promoted the integration of the people of Germany, including the immigrants and interreligious dialogue. And then he participated in past Tokyo conference, and then due to the schedule conflict, we have a video message from Mr. Wulff. Dear all, Mr. Kudo, I am pleased to see that you are discussing very important global issues at high-level meeting again this year. This strong commitment by all of you is very important in discussing complex topics at the international level. Unfortunately, I was unable to attend the conference for the second year in a row, and particularly due to coronavirus. I hope to be able to attend next year in 2022. It is true that our democracy and liberal values are under strong pressure from within and without. However, we have not been beaten down, and these values have not been beaten down. Therefore, there is no need for repair of these values. Our democracy is strong. As we saw in the attack on the US Capitol Hill, even if security guard is not enough, democracy has the capacity to defend itself against attack and has the capacity to deal with legal and legislative challenges. But this defensive capacity needs to be further strengthened. And as the democratic demonstrations in Myanmar show, democracy is attractive, and international cooperation is working in many places, which gives us confidence. But the corona crisis had sharpened existing problems. There is a fault line between countries that are based on international cooperation and those are becoming more nationalistic. Geopolitical and geoeconomic multipolarity is increasing, and conflicts are emerging between Western value concepts and autocratic and repressive forces. Thus, we are moving towards a world of multiple spheres of influence that will affect the entire world. There is also a power shift in the world by non-state actors. The combined market capitalization of tech giants Amazon, Apple, Facebook, Google, and Microsoft is about $7 trillion. This is more than the GDP of every other country in the world except the US and China. The influence on the younger generation is especially growing. The state of Nevada is considering giving these tech giants the right to build their own independent administrative cities with their own police and educational functions. The rise of emerging Asian powers is remarkable. China, the world's second-largest economy, is seeking more say and influence. China is the largest exporter and the second-largest importer, and with its large foreign exchange reserves, the Chinese currency is frequently used as an international trade currency along with the US dollar. The United States and the so-called West, including EU, Australia, and Japan, still expect other countries to recognize and adapt to the Western political and economic model as favorable. But we are, at the same time, being challenged by technology-driven countries in Asia that have very different ways of handling privacy and data protection. This is one of the challenges of digitization. At the same time, digitalization is best evidence of the world's connectedness. It is now easier than ever to communicate and work across borders. In 1995, there were 16 million internet users. By 2020, the number rose to 4.8 billion. Right now, about 1.8 billion people log on to Facebook every day. In 1909, the number of international organizations was 37. Only 100 years later, in 2009, the number had grown to 2,000. For a multipolar world to function peacefully, it must be based on cooperation and mutual respect, paying attention to the idiosyncrasies and differences of each country. In last year's Foreign Affairs report, Francis Fukuyama said, "Major crises usually have major consequences, usually in unpredictable ways." The Great Depression of 1929 led to isolationism, nationalism, fascism, and World War II. But it also brought about President Roosevelt's New Deal policies, the hegemony of the world superpower, the United States, and ultimately the end of the colonialism. The limited success of the military intervention implemented in response to the 9/11 attacks gave rise to new forms of Islamism. The financial crisis of 2008 also fueled anti-establishment populism around the world. Future generations of historians will be faced with the challenge of capturing the consequences of the coronavirus crisis in the context of a vastly changing overall picture. Some countries were able to overcome the crisis better than others. The difference is not in the composition or structure of democracy versus dictatorship. The reason for the responsible response had to do with the available resources, social confidence, and leadership skills of each country. The weaknesses and limitations of multilateralism were made clear by this crisis. One of the weaknesses can be seen in the dependence of the World Health Organization, WHO. Many countries have asserted their sovereignty by accepting only partial transparency and external control. But it is in times of crisis that the WHO must rely on the full cooperation of all countries. This is the reason for the lack of implementation capabilities so far. The coronavirus has triggered nationalistic and protectionist reaction. Countries panicked and put themselves outside the borders where they thought they would to be safe. But at the same time, what the coronavirus showed us is that we are so interconnected and dependent with each other that it makes no sense to isolate ourselves to the extreme. Viruses move across borders. Those borders have never been recognized in our daily competitive relationships or in the framework of global villages such as Europe. The crisis has also shown that we can move forward faster through cooperation. Vaccine developers were quick to network themselves and combine forces around the world to find a solution. They were the first to understand that only by thinking globally could we get out of the crisis. Thanks to the liberal world order of multilateralism, the world standards of living is improving. After the turmoil, there are uncertainties like a financial crisis and climate change, and there are nationalistic windtail, and the attack, xenophobic attack and anti-immigration have been increasing. Hungarian government and the Russian government and Philippines government are turning back to the democracy, taking this opportunity. And also there is an opportunity, chance for international conflicts to happen more often. And then there are people in some parts of the world who are living in a saturated situation, and there is a lack of direction everywhere. And then there are extreme activists and authors of complot. And there democracies needs to gain momentum with each individual's effort to make that it is understood that we have to unite our forces for the right purpose. So can we change our realization? I think that the coronavirus can be the start point to enhance the solidarity, because everyone needs to act together for the globalization and the growth. The expectation has not been reached, not in all countries, and disparities and inequalities grew in some countries, and there is a disillusion and despair. So simplistic promise sound attractive, and populist, however, populist promises do not have any immediate solution to current challenges for immigration, digitalization, or climate changes, and for coronavirus crisis. They have no answer. So our democracies need to face this and address this challenge with courage and responsibility. We should not be feared and turn our back to the democratic principle. If we do that, we just leave work the populist and extremist work. And due to the lack of the trust and reliability, they have not been successful fully yet. So we have to once again strengthen the moderates and peace promoters, and to weaken those populist powers. The essential characteristics of an international cooperation is a reconciliation and an understanding, and often the situations and the goal, the circumstances are different. Even if the goal is the same, approaches are different. Maintaining and strengthening the multilateralism is in the interest of every country. For instance, Germany, for security and trade, they have been beneficiary of the international global community order of the economy, open access to market and free trade. Thanks to them, there has been a possibility of the fair growth and share prosperity so far. Thanks to the world order based on the multilateralism, living standards and in the world have been improving. After the turmoil of war, Germany benefited greatly from its acceptance by the European and international community of nations and was able to develop its export and innovation capabilities. The same is true for Japan, in my view. Moreover, transatlantic security, European integration, and confidence in the United Nations are still stabilizers for us, all of us. The US and away from nationalism and protectionism to renewed emphasis on international cooperation. Instead of the deal, international agreements are being signed. Last year, I reported that the then US president saw the truth as negotiable. Fortunately, that has been changed by the new president. By the way, but the way truth is brought into the debate and conspiracy theories are spread has a lot to do with the abuse of digital tools. Democracy is being threatened by the virtual bubble of anonymity. I already made this point last year. While the possibilities of modern technology and the digitalization are attractive, we need more appropriate preventive measures against the dangers of the internet. We cannot risk so-called internet trolls paralyzing our healthcare system and government functions, inciting people to violence, manipulating them with misinformation, and so forth. The Coalition for Infectious Disease Epidemic Preparedness and Innovation, CEPI, brings together government and private actors to promote vaccine development and prevent future diseases. This is an exemplary success story of international cooperation. We need to promote networks, both analog and digital, that contribute to stability and the common good. Some decision makers around the world may object to international cooperation value, but scientists and the public health officials have already expanded international networks, and now everyone is benefiting from it. Across borders, scientists have shared their knowledge about the coronavirus and conducted many numbers of clinical trials. The New York Times called it a global collaboration unparalleled in the history. Transnational research networks have been strengthened, and foundations, companies, and everyone has been motivated to work together for the common good and for a common goal. It is also for the success of all. Globalization and digitalization are making the world more diverse. We need to move forward and support this process. We must not leave to populists. The key is to be willing to face each other, to not shy away from the unknown, to practice tolerance and to understand each other. If we can practice this diversity in a positive way, we can build a society that is innovative, courageous, strong, open, and tolerant. To do this, the ability to see things from a different perspective is essential. The philosopher Frank Wright talked about the overview effect, an effect often reported by astronauts. Looking at the Earth from the great universe humbles human beings and puts things in the right perspective. Neil Armstrong, the first human to set foot on the moon, said in retrospect, "I didn't feel like a giant. On the contrary, I felt very, very small." German astronaut Alexander Gerst, who has participated in many ISS expeditions, felt the same way and said, "I knew the Earth was round, but it was only when I looked at it from the space that I realized it was round." Human beings need to feel in order to understand. This is the same in space and on Earth. So let's not only respect each other and treat each other the same way, but also create a common perspective to make our common global village a little more inclusive. My dream, of course, is to make friends out of enemies. However, that is not an easy thing to achieve. Therefore, the first step is not to fight enemy, but to at least listen to the enemy in daily life and beyond, where it is with a neighbor in the same village or between nations. Encounters with strangers will save our society, said Bastian Babner, a German editor of Practical Peace and Reconciliation. In any case, I realize that the coronavirus has made clear to me how much humanity depends on solidarity, cooperation, and mutual aid. Media prefers negative headlines to positive ones, but we must not forget that what we have accomplished in the midst of all the hardships of the past year and a half. Vaccine development success stories, the COVAX initiative to help the poor, a neighbor who does the shopping for you, artists who communicate virtually, various donation activities to support families and businesses. It is easy to change our perspective on something so familiar. The desire to help is stronger than we think. That's the reason why we are hopeful, even on the work stage where the stakes are much higher. Our success and resilience in the coming decades will depend on how technologically advanced we will be, how well we will build viable governance institutions, and how productively, effectively, and sustainably we will use our resources. All of this must be done within the framework of international cooperation. In particular, it is ideal to be well prepared for and prevent natural disasters and economic crises. This requires being creative and having strong, resilient social institutions, smart governance, social cohesion, and values based on respect and dignity. We need to be networked at the political, human, environmental, and cultural levels, just as research institutions around the world are networked and share knowledge in order to share knowledge amongst themselves. We do not need a new bureaucracy, said UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. He said, what we need is a networked multilateralism that connects institutions at the global and regional levels, and an inclusive multilateralism that connects businesses, cities, universities, and movements, because global actors, not just countries, are providing solutions to complex issues and problems. Finally, here is a statement from the current world leaders, the leaders of EU and heads of states and governments around the world in early May 2020. We are not really safe unless every village, every city, every region, and every country in the world is safe. We cannot afford to return to a world where individual nations endanger the well-being of the humanity. This applies not only to overcoming the coronavirus, but far beyond that.
Thank
you very much, Mr. Wulff. It encompassed a broad range of topics. The point is liberal economy and multilateralism being very important, and we are one already. We are very much interdependent with each other, and such networking is something that can be triggered by the coronavirus pandemic. For just a moment, please. Do not play that video just yet. So that's the point being made by Mr. Wulff. That is why, in order to protect this international cooperation, we need to have understanding, and making concession can be an option. Even if you think the other part is an enemy, it's very important to listen to them to begin with. And now we have Mr. Yasutoshi Nishimura, who is very, very busy. He was actually supposed to come here, but he is very busy. So we have a video message from the Minister in charge of Economic Revitalization. Mr. Nishimura, the floor is yours. Good evening, everyone. I am Nishimura, in charge of Economic Revitalization. As you may know, I'm also in charge of coronavirus response. This is quite a special thing here in Japan, that it is quite unparalleled in the world. So I would like to talk about how we have been responding to the coronavirus and what should be the new way of economy and society and what should be the role to be played by Japan in the international community. Well, thank you for this opportunity. The coronavirus pandemic has damaged the global economy quite badly. The growth rate in 2020 was negative 3.4%. And each country came up with massive financial assistance to support businesses and people in need. And even under the lockdown, the economy has been barely sustained. And at the same time, central banks have come up with very bold monetary easing measures to support policies of the governments. So against this backdrop, the global economy, which was badly damaged, for instance, the trade of goods, back in October last year, it has back to the level before the coronavirus pandemic. And then the new Biden administration in the United States has come up with a very bold economic stimulus package, fiscal measures, and this has induced hopes around the world. According to OECD economic outlook, thanks to those factors, in the mid of this year, the GDP level will go back to the level before the pandemic. And as for the economy here in Japan, we have had unprecedented level of financial assistance and also bold monetary easing measures by the Bank of Japan, and they are ongoing and expanding. And as for 2020, the situation was quite dire for the economy. But as for the fiscal year 2021, in terms of the real terms, the growth rate expected is 4%. And during the fiscal year next year, the level of the economy will go back to the level before the coronavirus pandemic. According to IMF and OECD, the similar outlook has been presented. And this government's outlook, this is something that we would like to realize, and I am ready to do my utmost for that. A state of emergency was declared back in spring, and this depressed the economy in Japan. But from spring to the end of last year, we spent $2.74 trillion, and in the GDP rate, more than 50% of that is the biggest economic stimulus package that was introduced in Japan. The Japanese government is not really resorting to the idea of MMT. However, because of the infection, the situation is quite difficult for businesses and the people. And also, the Japanese economy has been damaged as well. Therefore, it's time to have massive fiscal measures, not cautiously, but boldly, to support businesses, employment, and livelihood of the people. Last year, in the state of emergency, the economy was in a dire situation between April to June. But from July to September, the growth rate was 22.8% annually, and from October to December, the annualized ratio of growth was 11.7%. So I do believe that we have high potential for growth in the Japanese economy. However, from January to March, we had the second round of the state of emergency declared. Therefore, January to March, we need to be for the minus economic growth. So talking about the state of emergency compared to the lockdown of other countries, it wasn't such a tough thing, such as a curfew or penalty. Those things were not imposed in Japan. This time, we thoroughly analyzed the data available and asked restaurants and bars to shorten their operation hours up until 8 p.m. So this was a very much a targeted approach this time around. Cinemas and theme parks and ballparks, these spectators' capacities were analyzed by supercomputer Fugaku. And we also obtained actual data, and we had science-based analysis to come up with the number. 50% capacity is all right. And also, as for baseball as well as sumo wrestling, up to 5,000 people can be accommodated safely in those venues. So we did not have a total ban like we had last spring. We maintained those activities, and we asked businesses, restaurants to close at 8 p.m. And we promoted teleworking of 70%. And through those measures, we were able to reduce the new infections by 80%. So without very strict penalties, this is thanks to the cooperation on the part of the people of Japan. So we will continue to have data analysis. We will use a Fugaku supercomputer to run simulation. And based on scientific findings, we would like to evolve the measures going forward further. We would also like to be working together with the international community and share Japanese experiences. And in this coronavirus situation, we can't bring down the number of new infections to 0. It would be difficult. So there will be a flare-up and a resurgence of infection. This will be seen in any country. But we should make sure that it won't be explosive. We have to be able to contain that. So although the state of emergency has been lifted, but we have to take all the precautionary measures, especially in restaurants and bars. For the time being, we have to focus not just on the economic recovery. Utmost priority is to contain the infection so that we can avoid the flare-up and resurgence of the infection. We have to be very careful with that while trying to recover the economy. Businesses which have been hit hard by the pandemic, we offered fiscal assistance. For instance, for small to medium-sized enterprises, up to $20,000 per company was given to 4.2 million businesses, the total of $52 billion. And 340 billion no collateral, no interest loans were extended to 2 million businesses. And this way, we were able to reduce the bankruptcy rate to quite a low level. And per employee, which include part-timers, the maximum monthly amount of $3,100 per month was paid to 2.9 million businesses, the total of $30 billion as employment sustained money. And for every person of Japan, we paid out $1,000 cash from spring to summer. This totaled $120 billion. And this way, we were able to suppress the unemployment rate, and we protected employment as well as the livelihood of the people in Japan. And on top of that, we are implementing other measures. The total of $33 billion has been extended to the restaurants and bars which cooperated with the shortening of the operation hours. And also, under this situation, those vulnerable people, including women and also non-regular workers, they were targeted with certain measures in a concentrated manner. Because we believe that the gap should not be fixated and a gap should not be reproduced in the future. And we believe we should not allow excessive gap or unacceptable level of gap, so that motivated people and talented people can exert their potential fully. And for that, we will support those people. In terms of the monetary measure, Bank of Japan is continuing to have very bold easing measures, especially long-term government bond, CPs, and ETF purchasing, as well as negative interest rate, yield curve control, as well as inflation target of 2% to be stabilized. Until that time, we will continue to have overshoot type commitment, which is being introduced, which is quite unparalleled in the world. And this Bank of Japan measures are supporting the policies that are implemented by the government. So we will continue to closely work with the Bank of Japan. So our government's policies and the Bank of Japan's monetary easing together will sustain the Japanese economy as much as possible. In the post-pandemic world, this pandemic has revealed the weakness of each country. In some countries, there is a problem of inequality and racism. Weaknesses have been revealed by the coronavirus. And over here in Japan, we have delay in digitalization, and also those vulnerable people, part-time workers and women, they have been hit very hard by the coronavirus pandemic. So going forward, towards the future, we need to implement reforms which have not been implemented in the past. And we now know that we can do it. For instance, in terms of the teleworking, here in Japan, it wasn't fully promoted. However, last spring, we were able to reduce the people commuting by 70%. So packed trains are a symbol of Japan in the morning, but actually in the trains, we were seeing some vacancies in seats. That was what happened last spring. And this time around, we asked people to reduce the commuting, and there was a reduction in the commuting by 30% through teleworking. So we now know we can do it. So as a symbol of new way of work, I would like people to continue doing this. We can use online measures, and those online tools are now being accepted widely. And I'd like to talk about the 3 New Deals: Digital New Deal, Green New Deal, as well as Human New Deal. These are the 3 new deals that I'd like to promote. And the government will make spending which will induce the private sector initiatives. We would like to accelerate their initiatives. First of all, talking about the Digital New Deal, we have been delayed and lagging behind in terms of the digitalization, but we will create a digital group with a digital agency, and many procedures will be able to be completed through the digital tools. We are working in earnest towards that end, and beyond 5G, the 6G, this can become the strengths of Japan. So tapping into the strengths and technologies of Japan and working together with the Western companies, we would like to do our utmost. And in terms of the Green New Deal, we have pledged carbon neutrality by 2050. In order to realize that, $18 billion fund has been prepared, now in place. And in 2030, 10 years from now, offshore wind, power generation, and hydrogen, where we have strengths in Japan. Across those 14 areas, we will formulate a growth strategy, spending around 830 billion per annum of the economic effect that can be expected. Finally, I would like to talk about investment into people. This is about Human New Deal. At the end of the last year, we came up with $90 billion university fund, which was incorporated into the economic measure plan. This is to foster young researchers. We would like to come up with the world-based platform for academia and industry collaboration. And for the next 5 years, we will come up with the school classes being smaller for children, and PCs and ICTs will be fully utilized for each child, so that they can have best chance in education. Towards the mid to long-term growth, we will boost labor participation, especially including women as well as the elderly. Those motivated peoples will have more opportunities to shine. In the 7 years of Abe administration, and this is now followed by the Suga administration, there has been a weakness of low birth rate as well as the aging of the society. Actually, the labor population has come down by 5.45 million. But in terms of the working women, there has been an increase of 3.34 million. And the elderly people work participation has increased by 2.85 million as well. From April this year, the employers need to provide the employment opportunity to up to 70 years of age. And also there will be an option to receive a pension benefit from only 75 years old. So motivated people, talented women, and as well as the healthy and motivated elderly people, they can continue to work if they wish to do so. So as many people as possible, they will be shifting from the beneficiary position to the supporters position in the social security system. And in this, we would like to overcome the weakness of Japan, which is the low birth rate as well as the aging of the society. And close to 5 million people are working as freelancers in Japan, so-called gig workers. In order to provide peace of mind and security of work, we will come up with the legal framework for anti-monopoly law and subcontractor transaction law, and also labor relationship laws. How are they going to be applicable in order to protect those freelancers? So we will come up with the guidelines which will be effective within the government as a whole in order to promote diversity in way of working. As I said already, employment adjustment support or subsidiary system has provided a support of employment. And we have been working very hard to protect employment. But at the same time, we would also like to promote a shift of the people towards the growth areas through recurrent education as well as occupation training. This is considered to be a focus area of our policy. So Digital New Deal, Green New Deal, and the Human Need New Deal, these are the three areas, and we will be working in earnest, focusing on these three areas. We will have enough government spending to induce investment as well as the ingenuity of the private sector so that the diverse talents can shine. Japanese economy and Japanese fiscal situation is considered to be very tough and in a dire situation. This is a view of the world. But after LDP, the Abe administration regained power in 2012, fiscal rehabilitation has been pursued. So this is something that's been pursued through the Abenomics, which is the growth strategy. We have seen some improvement. By 2019, the tax income increased by $200 billion, and the new government bond issuance was reduced by $100 billion. So fiscal rehabilitation efforts are very important. However, what we have to focus on is to protect businesses, employment, as well as livelihood of the people, and then put the economy back on track. So fiscal spending is something that we should be implementing without hesitation in order to put the economy back on track. And through that, through having the growth path, we can have fiscal rehabilitation. So without the economic rehabilitation, we will not be able to have fiscal rehabilitation. So we would like to apply a long-term perspective on the fiscal rehabilitation in this way. The coronavirus is a global crisis, and towards the end of the coronavirus pandemic, we need to have international cooperation, vaccine, and also the fair access to the therapies. We would like to work on that. And towards the realization of the Tokyo and the Olympic and Paralympic Games, I would like to do my utmost so that those games will be held with a peace of mind. Unilateralism is rampant across the world, but Japan is focusing on TPP-11 or CPTPP, or we have been focusing on Japan-EU EPA, and we are also promoting RCEP in the Asian region. So this is all for a free trade, and such free trade frameworks are considered very important, and we have been playing a very central role in those endeavors. We are the president of TPP this year, and as the president of TPP, we would like to promote implementation of digitalization and work on the resilience of supply chain. Advanced and well-balanced and the 21st century type, high standard rule-based trade agreement is something that we would like to expand across the world. And for that, we would like to work together with signatories so that they can ratify the agreement as soon as possible. And we would like to also work closely with the potential partner, for instance, the UK, which has expressed its willingness for accession. Of course, whether they can fulfill the high standards or not, we have to carefully watch that. But we would like to do our utmost as a presidency of TPP so that we can facilitate the process of the United Kingdom accession or negotiations. So we would like to make sure of the implementation of TPP and expansion thereof. We would like to be a flag bearer of free trade. So Camus, which wrote Pest, he said that a crisis can topple over existing order and can induce paradigm shift. The past pandemics also brought economic and societal transformation. For instance, pest back in the 14th century toppled over feudalism and induced Renaissance. And in 1910, Spanish flu expanded, and this triggered international cooperation of infectious disease control. And the Nations Health Organization, which is a predecessor of WHO, was established in 1923. So the international or global health cooperation was promoted with the Spanish flu as a trigger. And COVID-19 this time, this is an opportunity for reforms which have never been implemented in each country. For instance, after the bubble economy burst, there was a deflation and also the economic downturn, and we have lost 20 years. We'll be able to recover those 20 years through digitalization, which has been a challenge for a long time for us. We'd like to have drastic reforms towards that end. We would also have to fight against unilateralism. This is a time that a lot of countries can be inward-looking. That is why, even more so, we need to have international cooperation, liberal trade, and free investment. These are the things that we would like to drive as a leader of the world, so that we can also drive the global economic growth. With this, I would like to conclude my remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Nishimura is in charge of the economic recovery as well as the response to COVID-19. So he gave us very details. So he talked about the high-level standard rule-based trade of liberal trade. So international cooperation and the maintaining the liberal trade order are the ones that he emphasized and showed some determination. So based on this, we will go on to the panel discussion.